The story of Cambodia at first seems familiar. Like in Laos and Vietnam, they gained independence from the French. The countries were then led by kings and elites who favored the West, and left-wing rebel groups took up arms to confront them. And they all won virtually around the same time. In 1975, the communist groups in each of these countries overthrew their government, and the process of reforming their nations began. But this is where they all went in wholly different directions. Vietnam and Laos are to this day led by factions that evolved from these communist groups, but Cambodia has a different story. Their leaders had an incredibly extreme interpretation of communism. The reforms that they made in those first years would lead to one of the worst human tragedies of the 20th century. It lasted only for a few years, and it eventually ended when the communist government of Vietnam invaded Cambodia. This is the fall of the Khmer Rouge with hindsight. In 1973, the Khmer Rouge were rapidly gaining control of Cambodia, which was then known as the Khmer Republic. The government received help from the United States to halt their advance, and together they dropped over 500,000 bombs on their territory. And this would ultimately backfire, because this bombing resulted in such heavy losses of life and property that it inspired in many a want to join the revolution. The Khmer Rouge was getting stronger, and it took only another 2 years before they were marching on the capital and the country's leadership fled. This marked the beginning of a new era. It's not easy to talk about Cambodia. The things that happened here under the rule of the Khmer Rouge are so horrible, and they happen at such an enormous scale that it becomes a little overwhelming. This video is going to skip over all the gory details, but you can find articles in the description if you want to learn more about this. The leader of the Khmer Rouge was Pol Pot. He had led the guerrillas in the early years of the opposition, when they were based in the remote jungles of northeastern Cambodia. Pol Pot was inspired by the hill tribes that lived in this area. They had no need for money, and they were self-sufficient in their communal living. This was a major inspiration, and now that he had come to power, he implemented his drastic vision for the country as a whole. First, he renamed it to the Democratic Kampuchea. In the first few days of his rule, he sent roughly a quarter of the entire population, all people living in cities, to work on the communal farms in rural areas. Pol Pot's vision was to transform the country into a classless, rural society. This meant that as of this day, all private property was forbidden. Any expression of religion, humor, and affection were outlawed, and the government enforced strict laws on clothing. Social gatherings of 3 or more people were deemed illegal and could be punishable by death. And as private possessions were abolished, which also included money, there was no need anymore for banks. All banks and other financial institutions were thus dismantled, and Pol Pot's vision for a classless, rural society was becoming reality. Anybody that he perceived to be a threat to the revolution was put in a special camp. And then as a result of these measures, we now know that anywhere between 1.5 and 3 million people had died. The leadership in Vietnam was anxiously following these events. They had recently reunited the country and were undergoing reforms themselves. But many hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese had fled to Cambodia during the Vietnam War, and they were now perceived by the Khmer Rouge as a threat to the revolution. And besides that, they were laying claims on areas of Vietnam. The Cambodian army frequently crossed the border and raided villages in Vietnam, which in more than one instance led to civilian casualties. You see, Vietnam was a close ally of the Soviet Union, whereas Cambodia had closer ties with China. China sought to maintain its influence in the region through its support of Cambodia, which by Vietnam was perceived as a threat to its national security. As the relationship was heating up more and more, there was a large organized rebellion in the Cambodian military. And then Vietnam decided to do something about it. In December 1978, the Vietnamese army invaded Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge responded by sending tens of thousands of soldiers, amongst which were many ill-prepared civilians, to halt the Vietnamese offensive. But the Khmer Rouge was no match for the might of the Vietnamese army. They advanced in less than a month to the capital of Cambodia, and the leadership of the Khmer Rouge was forced to flee. They re-established themselves in remote parts of the country, close to the border with Thailand. The Khmer Rouge would remain active for many more years, but they gradually lost their power and their influence. Cambodia started to reopen their country to the international community, and by doing so, the horrors of the years under the Khmer Rouge gradually began to surface. But it would take years before a tribunal finally started to try its leaders, and to date, only 3 prominent leaders have been sentenced. Hey, the suggested video here on the left talks about how the Pathet Lao overthrew the monarchy in Laos. Check it out next, you might like it.